All right, so get ready, because today we are going to really dive deep into a true crime story. One that'll make you wonder just how well you really know those, living right next door to ya. We're headed to what seems like a peaceful suburb, right outside Richmond, Virginia, back in 2004. It's Halloween weekend, but instead of spooky fun, this community is about to be hit with a real-life horror story.
Suburbia as the backdrop for a crime like this always is intriguing.
Yeah.
It creates the sense of unease, like disrupting the expected order.
Yeah, you got that right. Our source today is this true crime podcast called 48 Classics, Two Wigs and a Gun. And we're taking on the first part of this two-part episode. It's pretty wild, trust me. So this story centers on Fred Jablin, a well-respected college professor and a father of three, who's found shot dead right in his own driveway. Imagine the shockwaves that sent through that community.
For sure, the victim's profile, like in a case like this, really shapes how things unfold. A college professor, this figure of authority and intellect,
Yeah.
murdered so brutally, it instantly makes the case more serious.
Oh, absolutely. So the story starts with a neighbor hearing gunshots early one Saturday morning. But here's the thing, nobody actually saw who fired the shots. Immediately, that throws suspicion on everyone around Fred, making the investigation way more complex.
Yeah, that lack of an eyewitness is a double-edged sword. It creates a gap in terms of leads, but it also forces those investigators to, really analyze every relationship, every single interaction the victim had.
So let's go back to the very beginning. The discovery of Fred's body. It's his neighbor's wife who finds him. While she's out for a walk, something unusual in the driveway caught her eye. Police get there and find Fred dead, shot multiple times. His three young kids, thankfully, are still asleep inside the house, totally unaware of the tragedy that just happened right outside their door.
Yeah, the children's presence and, more importantly, their safety adds a layer of complexity to the crime scene for sure. It suggests that the perpetrator either knew the layout of the house, knew the family's routine, or had absolutely no intention of harming the children.
Yeah, it's a chilling detail for sure. And one that raises questions about what the killer's motive could have been. One of the first responders on the scene, Officer Boyd, actually has kids who are friends with Fred's children. Can you imagine responding to a scene like that and knowing the kids inside are friends with your own? Officer Boyd ended up taking Fred's children in while the family was being contacted. A small act of kindness in the face of such a horrific event.
Yeah, that personal connection must have been incredibly difficult for Officer Boyd. It speaks to the ripple effect of violent crime. You know how it reaches so far beyond the immediate victim and family. It affects the entire community.
Absolutely. And as the news spreads, we hear from Fred's brother Michael, who's understandably in complete shock. Then there's Fred's ex-wife, Piper Roundtree, calling from Houston, saying she's just stunned by the news of his death.
Those initial reactions are so crucial, but you have to be careful not to read too much into them. Grief and shock, even guilt, can manifest in unexpected ways, making it hard to tell real emotion from a carefully constructed facade.
That's a really good point. Now enter Detective Kobe Kelly, the lead investigator on the case. He starts immediately digging into Fred's background, looking for any enemies. Any reason someone might want him dead. Was there a disgruntled student? A business deal gone wrong? Anything that could point him in the right direction.
That's standard procedure, but a smart one, even with suspicions around those close to Fred. You can't just focus on one thing. You gotta explore everything, no matter how unlikely.
Exactly. And here's where things take an interesting turn. Neighbors. Those who knew Fred and his family. They suggest Detective Kelly look a little closer to home, specifically at Fred's ex-wife, Piper.
The ex-wife. A classic suspect in any true crime story. That relationship. It's often full of tension, resentment, and lingering emotions, especially if the divorce was messy.
And believe me, this divorce was not a walk in the park. But before we get into that, there's another key player we need to introduce. Piper's sister, Tina. Now remember how I mentioned Detective Kelly is going through flight records? Well, guess whose name pops up? Tina's. She flew from Houston to Virginia just 2 days before the murder.
Now that is something that would make any investigator nervous. It puts Tina on the radar immediately. Makes you wonder about her involvement and what her relationship with her sister was really like.
Yeah, the podcast paints a very specific picture of these sisters. They're described as soul sisters. Incredibly close, almost inseparable. Tina in particular is described as this Amazonian figure, strong-willed and capable of anything she puts her mind to.
That description of Tina is really interesting. You have to wonder if it's objective or if it's colored by those giving the interviews, like maybe revealing some underlying biases or anxieties about strong, independent women.
That's a really good point. It's something we should revisit as we get deeper into the story. But for now, let's go back to how Fred and Piper even met. They met when Piper was Fred's student at the University of Texas.
That adds a whole other layer to their relationship dynamic. Student-teacher romances often have a power imbalance, which can have a big impact down the road, especially if the relationship ends badly.
It definitely does. At first, their relationship seemed happy, at least according to Fred's best friend. Piper became a successful lawyer, then a stay-at-home mom when their first child was born. But things changed when they moved to Richmond. Tina believes Fred orchestrated that move to isolate Piper from her family and support system in Texas.
If that's true, it suggests a pattern of control and manipulation from Fred, which could explain why the marriage fell apart. It's a classic tactic abusers use to gain power over their partners.
And the divorce was anything but amicable. Piper filed for divorce and a protective order against Fred, alleging domestic violence.
Whoa, that's a serious accusation, one that really changes the investigation. If Fred was abusive, it opens up a whole new set of motives and potential suspects.
Tina, of course, completely supported her sister's claims, describing Fred as this controlling and manipulative husband. But Fred fought back, and ultimately he won full custody of the children, and Piper was ordered to pay child support. This understandably made Tina resent Fred even more. She believed he used his expertise in communication, his ability to sway people, to win unfairly.
Custody battles are rarely easy. It's normal for both sides to feel like they were wronged. But it's interesting that Tina attributes Fred's success to his communication skills. Like she sees him as a master manipulator, someone who can twist the truth to get what he wants.
It definitely adds another dimension to how she sees him, and it sets the stage for what happens next.
It's like a pressure cooker, isn't it? All these emotions, these simmering resentments, and then suddenly Fred is murdered. It's hard not to see how those are connected.
You said it. So Piper's back in Houston, having to take any legal work she can find to make ends meet. She's struggling financially, heartbroken over losing her kids, and only sees them 6 days a month. Meanwhile, Tina, fiercely protective of her sister, watches all this happen. Her anger toward Fred growing every day. It's a powder keg waiting to explode.
And as we know, someone lit that fuse. The question is who?
Exactly. And while all of this is happening, the police are closing in on the Rantry sisters. They stake out Piper's home in Houston, eventually following her to her lawyer's office. The tension is building, and the stakes are getting higher and higher.
Yeah, the police are building their case. But it seems like they're walking a tightrope. They have their suspicions about the sisters. But they got to be careful, too, especially with the kids involved.
Right, it's a tough situation. So Piper and Tina finally meet with the police. But instead of this big interrogation, the conversation is all about the children's well-being. Tina even demands the children be brought to Houston, arguing they need their mother and aunt more than ever.
It's a smart tactic whether it was intentional or not. By focusing on their role as caregivers, they're kind of shifting the focus away from the murder investigation. It reminds us that even during a crisis, people try to control how others see them.
It really makes you wonder how much of what we're hearing is genuine and how much is calculated. And just when you think you're understanding Piper's feelings toward Fred, we get these totally different stories. Her lawyer and new boyfriend say she didn't have any bad feelings toward him, even after that nasty divorce.
That's always tricky. We're relying on what others say, filtered through their own relationships and biases. It's impossible to know for sure what was really going on in Piper's mind.
That's so true. And right as the episode ends, Piper drops this bombshell. She says someone else might have wanted to kill Fred bad enough to do it, someone we haven't even met yet.
Whoa, talk about a cliffhanger. She's planting a seed of doubt there, opening up a whole new area to investigate. It leaves us wondering just how deep this whole thing goes.
That final statement from Piper, hinting at another suspect, really changes things up. It's almost like she's setting a trap for the investigators, leading them down a different path. But before we get into that, let's go back to the police chasing after Tina after the murder. Remember they initially missed her at the airport in Houston? It
is strange, isn't it? Like, you have officers specifically looking for her. They're even stopping women who look like her, and she just disappears. Makes you wonder if she was trying to avoid being caught.
Yeah, it feels like something from a spy movie. But remember that podcast title, 2 Wigs and a Gun? It makes you think maybe those wigs helped her disappear.
Using disguises is a classic move to avoid being seen, especially in a serious situation like this. It shows a level of planning that's kind of creepy, especially if Tina was involved in the murder.
Let's go back to after the divorce and custody battle. The podcast really paints a vivid picture of how bad things were between Fred and Piper.
The details are like broken pieces of a mirror, each one showing a different side of this really broken relationship. You see accusations, resentment, and a fight for control.
It's like watching a train wreck in slow motion. One thing that stands out is the protective order Piper filed against Fred a year and a half before the divorce, claiming domestic violence.
That's a serious accusation, one that needs to be looked at carefully. But the podcast doesn't give us much background or proof. It's important to remember that we're only hearing one side of the story.
All right, we're seeing things from Tina's point of view. And understandably, she's on her sister's side. She claims Fred was controlling, verbally abusive, and had a bad temper. She even says he mistreated the children. But without hearing Fred's side, it's hard to know what to believe.
It's really important not to jump to conclusions here. The truth is usually complicated, not black and white.
Absolutely. What we do know is that the divorce was a huge fight, and Fred ended up getting full custody of the kids, with Piper ordered to pay child support. This, of course, made Tina even angrier at Fred. She thought it was completely unfair that he used his communication skills to manipulate the court and take her sister's children.
Losing custody of your children is devastating. It makes sense that Tina would want to protect her sister and be angry at the man she blames for her pain.
It's like a domino effect.
Huh?
One thing leads to another, creating a chain reaction of resentment and hate. And as Piper trying to rebuild her life in Houston, facing money problems and limited time with her kids, those feelings of anger and injustice probably just got worse.
That financial pressure adds another layer to the story. It's a common reason for crimes. It's easy to see how someone in Piper's shoes might feel desperate.
Meanwhile, the podcast shows a very different picture of Fred in Richmond. He seems to be doing well, embracing being a single dad. He's described as a loving and involved parent, going to school events, helping with homework, being there for his kids all the time.
It's a big difference from what Tina and Piper say about Fred. It makes you question if those accusations are true, and reminds us that people are complicated, capable of good and bad.
It's like those optical illusions, where the same image can look totally different depending on how you see it.
Exactly. And as we try to understand these different stories and biases, it's important to keep an open mind.
So we have Piper struggling in Houston, resentful towards Fred for taking her children. Then there's Tina, her fierce protector, who's also banned from seeing her nieces and nephews. And on top of all that is the murder investigation, with the police closing in, trying to find the truth.
The tension is real. You can almost feel the pressure on Piper and Tina as the investigation heats up.
The podcast then takes us inside those first interviews with the sisters. And what's interesting is how much they focus on the well-being of the children.
It's a smart move, whether they meant it or not. By talking about their role as caregivers, they're kind of shifting attention away from themselves and the murder.
It's like they're controlling the story, wanting to seem like loving and caring aunts and mothers, even though suspicion is all around them. And remember, Tina's demand to have the children brought to Houston. It makes their claim of being the primary caregivers stronger.
It's a bold move. It shows how determined they are to stay in control of the situation.
But while Tina is busy being the protector, Piper is working hard to make her alibi for the night before the murder solid. Remember, she was in Houston when Fred was killed in Virginia, but she needs to prove she couldn't have gone to Virginia that Friday night.
Her alibi is super important. If she can prove she wasn't anywhere near the crime, it would basically eliminate her as a suspect.
And she does just that. She goes back to the bar where she says she was that Friday night, and the bartender remembers seeing her there. She even gives the police names of other people who were there who can back up her story.
That's a big win for Piper. A solid alibi supported by witnesses can make or break a case. It looks like she's built a strong defense.
But even though Piper seems to be in the clear, there are still doubts about Tina. Remember that plane ticket with her name on it, the one the police were waiting for her on? And her behavior, her fierce loyalty to her sister, her open hatred for Fred, it all looks pretty suspicious.
Her actions and words definitely raise some red flags. The timing of her trip, along with her strong personality, make her a prime suspect.
The police are definitely cautious of both sisters, saying that their reactions to Fred's death weren't what they'd expect from grieving family.
It's a balancing act, isn't it? Grief can look like a lot of different things, but certain behaviors can also mean guilt or deception. It's the investigator's job to figure those things out, to tell the difference between real emotions and a fake act.
And just when this episode seems to be wrapping up, the podcast throws us a curveball, something that makes you question everything you thought you knew. Tina, in a random remark, seems to admit to killing Fred.
Wow, that's a big twist. The words come out of nowhere. It's an admission that throws the whole investigation into chaos.
Those words, it's not what did I think about Fred Jablin. Did I kill Fred Jablin? Yes. They just hang there. leaving you stunned, trying to understand what they really mean.
It's the ultimate cliffhanger. It leaves you in shock and wanting more. What was Tina thinking? Was she really confessing, or was it a trick? The truth, it seems, is just out of reach, waiting to be revealed in the last part of this crazy story.
We're back. And man, that apparent confession from Tina's really got me thinking. Did she actually just say she killed Fred?
It definitely sounds like it at first, those words. It's not, what did I think about Fred Jablin? Did I kill Fred Jablin? Yes. Yeah, they're pretty incriminating. But context is everything here. We need to think about what was going on when she said that.
You're right. The podcast doesn't really tell us what led up to those words. Was it a real confession because she felt guilty? Or was it just her being angry in the moment? Or maybe she was trying to trick the investigators, maybe to protect Piper.
That's the big question, isn't it? Maybe Tina was just expressing how much she hated Fred in an over-the-top way, like her words were more about emotion than actually admitting guilt. Or maybe she was trying to confuse the police on purpose, knowing that what she said would cause chaos.
It's like she's playing a game, carefully making moves to outsmart her opponents. And remember this Kina we're talking about, the Amazonian sister, the fierce protector. She doesn't back down from a fight.
Yeah, her personality makes this case even more complicated. She's seen as resourceful, strong-willed, and totally loyal to her sister. It's possible she would go to extremes to protect Piper, even if it meant going to jail herself.
Okay, let's say that's true for a minute. If Tina did kill Fred, how could she have done it? She was in Houston, and the murder was in Virginia. That would take some serious planning.
It would be a challenge for sure. She'd need to travel without being noticed, get a gun, kill Fred without leaving any evidence.
Yeah.
And then disappear. It's a lot to do, but not totally impossible.
Remember that plane ticket in Tina's name? The one the police were waiting for her on? What if she wasn't ever on that flight? What if it was a distraction?
That could be it. She could have easily used a fake ID or traveled under a different name. Maybe she flew into a different airport, rented a car, and drove to Richmond. That would explain how she got past the police.
So she could have been in Virginia the whole time, hiding out, waiting for her chance. It's kind of scary to think about.
Yeah, it fits with what we know about her personality. Tina is someone who takes charge, makes tough decisions, and acts fast. Someone who could pull off a plan like that.
And what about the murder weapon? Where'd she get a gun?
That's another piece of the puzzle. Maybe she brought it from Texas or got it illegally in Virginia. It's something the investigators would have to figure out.
And remember the podcast title, 2 Wigs and a Gun. What if those wigs weren't just a random detail? What if they were part of Tina's plan to change her looks and not get noticed?
I think that's an interesting idea. Criminals often use disguises to hide from the police. Maybe Tina used those wigs to change her appearance, so it would be hard for people to recognize her.
So maybe this is what happened. Tina, wanting to protect her sister and hating Fred, carefully plans and carries out this crazy scheme to commit murder. It sounds like a movie.
It does. But we gotta remember that we're just guessing here. The podcast doesn't give us all the answers. We have more questions than answers. It's up to us to think about the evidence, consider everyone's side of the story, and come to our own conclusion.
Exactly. That's what makes this deep dive so interesting. It makes us think critically, question what we believe, and accept that the truth can be complicated. We're given a puzzle with missing pieces and have to fill in the blanks ourselves.
Yeah, it reminds us that the truth is hard to find. It's all about different points of view and interpretations. Sometimes the best stories are the ones that leave us wondering.
So what do you think? Was Tina being serious when she confessed, or was it all an act? Did she act alone, or was Piper part of it? And what about that other possible suspect Piper mentioned? We might never know the whole truth, but exploring all the possibilities, trying to put together the pieces of this complicated story, has been quite a ride.
And that's what's great about a good mystery, isn't it? The excitement of trying to figure it out, the challenge of untangling all the threads, and that feeling of wonder that sticks with you even after the story is over.